How do
Gotta drop the cheek.
yes, yes, yes. I'm gonna minimize this for a second. Oh, there you go. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And okay, we have a long shiur today. A lot of sources they're not in the. I specifically didn't share and print out the source sheet for the people who are here because I only gave you the essential and the much more expansive one we're going to do online because otherwise it would have been, it would have been too much. Can you, Caroline, who's in the Zoom room? Is it Caroline?
Yes, it is. What's up?
Caroline, can you share the PDF in this so I can just open it up from my I want to open it up and share it from my side if that's okay. But I don't want to go in.
It is currently here. I just shared it, but it is currently. I will reshare it again. Yes. Also happy to be the one to share it. So.
No, I know, but I also want to move. I'm going to want to move. I appreciate it. Let's see. Is it in the chat?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay, I can't see the chat. Okay. Ist nicht. What can I reach it out of that? One minute. No, I just got to that one. No, I just want to do 1 second. There we go. Okay, thank you. Now I got it. Okay. In the chat. Okay, great. There we go. Okay, let's make Brachot Torah, and then we'll all right, ready? Let's make Brachot Torah, okay? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. All right, let's look at so many things going on here. It's really wild. How do I erase nicht? Let me get this. Let me get rid of this. Oh, Gewalt. Technology. Gravity. Okay, let's go. We're going to share here. And I want to look at a very interesting practice. And also, in addition to this practice, I want to look at the structure behind it. Gewalt. What's going on? All right. And okay, let's just what happened to good old paper? At one point you could just use paper, right? So I just wanted to save paper. And now I'm wasting time while I'm saving paper. Okay, so there's a very strange practice called Kiddush Levana. I grew up with it. If you grew up in the Orthodox world, it was quite a common thing. And I want to look at its structure, and I want to look at it, and I want to, can people share in the Zoom God see this screen? Can you see it? It would be, in a perfect world, I'd be able to make this into a full screen here, but it's not allowing me. I don't know why, but let's make it larger. There we go. Okay. Make sure larger. Make this larger.
Make it larger. Yes.
I'm trying to make it larger, and
You could probably zoom in on it.
Right.
yeah. Thank you. All right. All right. Okay, so that only took a full 5 minutes. Okay, here we go. So Kiddush Levana means literally to sanctify. Levana is one of the Hebrew words used for the moon. It's one of two Hebrew words that are used. Levana actually is the biblical. There are two words, Yerach or Yareach and Levana, and this practice of sanctifying the new moon is actually a practice that takes place until the middle of the month. You can, as soon as the moon begins to wax towards its full moon status, usually on Motzei Shabbat at the end of Shabbat, there's an elaborate ritual of sanctifying the new moon. Now, let's look at the ritual itself, and then we'll get into its source in midrashic sources, halachic sources, and some other sources around superstition and magic. The midrash behind it is really the essence of this. When we talk about the midrash quite a bit, it appears in a number of forms in the Talmud, especially in Chulin and Samach Amud Aleph on 60a. But we'll look at it, and it's really fascinating on many levels. I love it on many levels. I've loved it for a long time, and it's actually the source of a lot of extra midrashic material in Chassidus and in other places too. Okay, so let's look at it. Can you look on you can look on your sheets? This is on everyone's sheets, both online and here in person. And it goes something like this. It begins, I have this here, this is the essence of it, source number one, but we can begin in source number two. It begins in the Sephardi ritual, in the Sephardic custom. They would recite this psalm. Psalm, I think it's Psalm 147, Hallelujah, Hallelujah, right? Praise God from heaven, Bam Romem from the heights, right? Praise God, all of the angels, Hallelujah, Kol Tzva'av, all of the retinue, Hallelujah, Shemesh v'Yareach, praise Him, sun and moon, you see Yareach there, Hallelujah, Kol Kochei Or, praise God, all of the stars, the starlight, lights of stars that have light, Hallelujah, Shmei Hashemayim, the highest heavens, and also the Amayim Shemei Ala Shemayim, and also the waters that are beneath the firmament. It goes on and on and on. So this is the first moment, right? And then the rite begins here. Right? Baruch atah Adonai. It's line 4. Blessed are you, God. Asher b'ma'amaro barash chakim. Who within God's word, ma'amar is God's commanding word. Barash chakim. He created shchakim is another word for firmaments. And through God's breath, or the speech of God, right, the mouth speech, there is all of these tzva'am, all of the retinue, right, which again is referring probably to the stars, right, the whole heavenly phalanx. Chok uzman natan lahem, gave them specific time, gave to them, shelo yishanu tafkidam, that they should not change their tafkid, which is their mission, right? Gave them specific deployment, and and so they're not allowed to change. In other words, they're reliable, right? Sasim usmechim latzor kunam. They rejoice and they're happy in doing the bidding of their Creator. Po'el emet. God is a truthful worker, right? Shepulaso emes, and God's work is truth. And said to the Levana, the white one, Levana is the also another mood for the moon, said that she should that she should renew the beautiful crown to those who are of womb birth, the womb birthed ones. Who are the womb birthed ones, the ones who are born of the Amuse Batan, are we are obviously talking about us. We are the womb ones. We also will be renewed as she is renewed in the future. To give beauty and adornment to our Creator, on the name, in the name of God's blessed kingdom. Baruch atah Yah, blessed are you, source of life. Mechadesh chadashim, the one who renews months. Now, first of all, how many people knew have you heard of this before? This is what we say. This is what is done in the rite called Kiddush Levana. This is this is in the Talmudic period. It's not some late mystical, wild thing. It's already, this blessing is found in the Talmud, which again, also mystical and magical and superstitious too. Now it gets even more funky. Watch this. Then we say, Baruch Yotzrech, blessed is your, now we move into the third person, they go back and forth. Blessed is your maker, Baruch Osech, the one who created you. Blessed is your creator, blessed is the one who made you. Baruch Konech, the one who is, Konech is another term for God, and the one who's, we are God's acquisitions, God is our creator, Baruch Borech. And then we say this, Kishem Shani Roked Kenegdech, just as I dance before you, just as I dance before you, and I can't touch you. Even as high as I dance, I can't touch you, meaning the moon. May all of my enemies not be able to touch me either. Okay. Now,
Is that the moon speaking?
no, this is what we're saying. We're saying just as I'm going to dance
Okay.
in front of you, moon, and I can't touch you.
Yeah.
May all of my enemies also, even if they're dancing, they can't touch me either. They focus here on not being able to touch you. Now, is the dancing here like the Macarena? What's the dance here? Like, is it the dance of is it jumping? Is it like one of those basketball? You have like gravity, and you're like trying to improve your vertical leap. What's going on here? You'll see in a second. It's wild, right? Tipol alehem emat tavafachad, and it quotes here a verse from Song of Songs, Song of the Sea, rather, chapter 15, the book of Exodus. Tipol alehem emat tavafachad, may your fear and trembling, right, fall upon them, meaning the enemies. By the way, not such a small deal this morning, given that we struck Iran, that Israel struck Iran overnight, and now all Israel, like the back and forth now of what now is Iran going to do? Okay, Tipol alehem emat tavafachad. With your great outstretched hand, they can be compared to a stone. Now, this is inverted, this verse, right? Now, the same verse is inverted. And then we say, David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam. David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam. King David is alive and well. King David is alive and well. And, all right, so this is this. I'm not even going to get into the rest of it. Just to you get a sense of this. Of the strangeness. Now we'll quote tons more verses, but the essence of this ritual is the blessing and the dancing. The blessing and the dancing, and then this Yihiratzon. Let's go to the top to the Yihiratzon, because this also appears in early sources. You'll see. Yeah, you with me? It's on source 1. I went back to source 1. Yihiratzon Fanecha. Everybody with me so far? We have a blessing over this new moon. We have verses to prepare us, and then we have a blessing that God creates the heavens. Shelo yishanu tafkidam, that they shouldn't change their deployment. The moon should do what she does, and everybody else should do what they do. In other words, this entire retinue of the army of the divine are all good workers. They do what they're supposed to do, and one day she will be renewed, just like we will one day be renewed. What is that referring to? Maybe it's just referring to the renewal of the moon each month. But here it gets a little bit wonky. Look at this. And this is where the drawing of the Midrash becomes really clear. Source 1. May it be your will, Adonai, my God, and God of my ancestors, to fill the diminishment of the moon. The diminishment of the moon. Lemalot, the pagam. A pagam is not just diminishment, it's like an injury. It's something injurious. Like there's a pagam is usually a defect, also in modern Hebrew. Also, like a pagam is like a defect. Something is broken. That it shouldn't be in any way mi'ut l'ma'et, needs to be diminished. The or halavana ki or chama, that the light of the moon would be like the light of the sun. Now that is from the book of Isaiah, right? In the future days. What? Okay. In the future, the prophecy is that the light of the moon will be like the light of the sun, right? And then or Shivat Yimei Breshit, Yimei Breshit, and that the light, their light itself will be like the light of the 7 days creation, Kimo Shaita Kodem Miuta, as it was before she was diminished, right? As the light of the moon was before its diminishment, as it says. Shne'emar, et shnei hameorot hagidolim. As it says in the chapter 1 of the book of Genesis that we read this morning in Shul, that God created 2 great lights. Not one great and one small, but both great. Okay, so this is all requires unpacking, right? So let's look here in your sources. Not in the source on your sheet, you're going to have to look on the page because we were very mindful of creation, on Shabbat of creation, not to destroy any more trees than we have to. Now, before we get there, I wanted to bring this study in magic and religion from the Golden Bow. This is one of the most classic works of magic and the study of religious traditions across the board, in a multicultural way. Imagine that James Fraser writes, we can more easily picture to ourselves the anxiety which the savage, by the way, I want to put savage in quotation marks, it's clearly a 19th century text, forgive him for being limited. Right, so more easily picture, we might just say, a more primal, right, an anxiety of humanity at a much earlier stage of its evolution, in terms of its technology and its understanding of the universe around it. By the way, it's also clear that the more primitive cultures, quote unquote, or the earlier indigenous cultures had clear knowledge that we didn't have too. But we can readily imagine there might have been some anxiety as the continued operation of what we now call the laws of nature and earlier humans with their narrow sphere of observation and short-lived tradition lacked the very elements of that experience which alone could set their mind at rest in face of the ever-changing and often menacing aspects of nature. I think that's a generous reading of likely what it felt like to be in a world that you didn't fully understand. I think we still feel it. It's not unique, right? Anytime you don't understand something, it can create, especially if it has an element of quote-unquote menacing, right? It creates a degree of anxiety, for sure. Now, he writes, no wonder, therefore, that humans are thrown into a panic by an eclipse and thinks that the sun or the moon would surely perish if he did not raise a clamor and shout his puny shafts into the air. So I definitely have opinions about this, but okay, let's just read it. Into the air to defend the luminaries from the monster who threatens to devour them. Now, this is true that in early mythic constructions of what would take place when there would be an eclipse, there is this sense of danger, and that without human agency, the luminaries would not reemerge, right? No wonder he is terrified when in the darkness of night, a streak of sky is suddenly illuminated by a flash of a meteor. The meteor or the whole expanse of the celestial arch glows with the fitful light of the northern streamers. Even phenomena which recur at fixed and uniform intervals may be viewed by them with apprehension before he has come to recognize the orderliness of their recurrence. To the primitive sage, he watched the changing aspects of earth and heaven with a perpetual wonder, alternately delighted and alarmed, elated and cast down, according as the vicissitudes of light and heat of plant and animal life ministered to his comfort or threatened his existence. As day by day the sun sank lower and lower in the sky, could he be certain that the luminary would ever retrace his heavenly road? Even the waning moon, this is the last part here, which is great. Even the waning moon, whose pale sickle rose thinner and thinner every night over the rim of the eastern horizon, may have excited in his mind a fear, lest when it had wholly vanished, there should be moons no more. Oh no. So again, this kind of, a very decidedly modernist condescension towards the pre-modern, and also a decidedly honest, I think, understanding of what might have been a phenomena that seems to be cross-cultural of anxiety around even the most obviously fixed recurring events until they became clear again. But whether that's how that plays into the Jewish version in the 5th and 6th century, we'll hold off for a second. But here, this is interesting because moon worship, of course, was quite common, right? So if you look at this in the Encyclopedia Britannica, there was a widespread phenomenon appearing in various eras and cultures. Moon worship has engendered a rich symbolism and mythology. The moon is viewed in terms of the rhythmic life of the cosmos and is believed to govern all vital change. The cyclical process of disappearance and appearance of the moon is the basis of the widespread association of the moon with the land of the dead, the place to which souls ascend after death, and the power of rebirth. In astrology also, by the way, in various forms, in Vedic astrology, also in Western astrology, the moon is, along with Saturn, the planet of karma, quote unquote, the planet of fate. The moon is connected with one's fate and one's past life, and where one is, the womb of which one emerges from. It's a lot of moon, feminine womb imagery in ancient, in Babylonia and also in Egypt, and certainly in Judaism too. You'll see in a second, the moon is very deeply connected with the sense of rebirth and with birth itself. The lunar governance of this cycle likewise leads to associations of the moon with fate. The mythology of the moon emphasizes especially those periods when it disappears, the 3 days of darkness in the lunar cycle, and eclipses. Both are usually interpreted as a result of battles between some monster who devours or slays the moon and who subsequently regurgitates or revives it. The interregnum is interpreted as an evil period necessitating strict taboos against beginning any new or creative period, planting or sex. Okay, obviously planting and sex are so clearly connected. In primitive hunting cultures, the moon is frequently regarded as male, particularly in regard to women, is understood as preeminently evil or a dangerous figure. But in agricultural traditions, the moon is usually regarded as female and as the benevolent ruler of the cyclical vegetative process. Certainly is the Israelite, right, those who we were not a hunting culture, and Israel was, of course, an agricultural culture. And the moon is deeply connected with the cyclical vegetative process and deeply connected in our ancient lore with all things related to the feminine, as you'll see in a minute. Now, let's go back to the original problem or the original question about this ritual. With all of that as kind of background, look at this problem midrashically for the rabbis have a problem. In verse 16 in the Torah this morning, describing the creation of the luminaries on the 4th day of creation, right? We have this verse. Can everybody see it? Can you see it? It's hard to make out, but I wanted to save the trees. And God, Elohim, creates the Shnei HaMeorot HaGedolim, the 2 great lights. Ma'or means to bring or, to bring light. When was light created, by the way? First day, right? The very first thing created was light. So, okay, the 4th day is when the luminaries are created. What was the light that was created on the first day of creation? That's a question the rabbis take up and answer, that the light of creation is in 2 sources. One is from God in the first day, and one is from the luminaries on the 4th day. But the light that was in creation before the luminaries were created was hidden because it was too pristine, it was too beautiful, it was too powerful to be used. Right? We had to make use of luminary light and not divine light. So it's planted, and where it's planted into the ground, as it were, hidden away. Or Hagaluz, it's called, the light that is hidden, the hidden light. So here in this verse, there are 2 great lights created. The great light. Do you see there's a problem already? It says 2 great lights, and it says the great light to rule by day, and then the small light to rule by night, and also the stars. You see the problem? Let me say it again. God creates 2 great lights, the great light for the day and the smaller light for the evening. You see the problem? Yeah?
No.
Let's do it again. God creates two great, listen carefully. God creates two great lights. The great light to serve by day, and the small light to serve at night.
Is a light left over.
Is there a light left over? But then just listen to the words.
Initially,
God creates two great lights. Both lights are described as
Great.
great.
And when
The great light for day and the smaller light for night.
hierarchy.
So what happened to both of them being great between the beginning of the verse and the end of the verse? Now, one could argue there were two great lights, and within the two great lights, one was greater than the other one. That would be a simple answer, right? But that didn't satisfy the rabbis in the Talmud. So let's make sure we have the problem, the Midrashic hook. Yeah? You hear the Midrashic hook? Now again, a lot of Midrashic hooks don't have to be, it can easily be explained, can more easily be explained, let's say, by Occam's razor, like what would be the most simplest way to explain this. But that's not, again, then they're taking all the fun out of Midrash. The Midrash is like the rabbis are bothered by something. There is a textual hook. It doesn't have to be the best hook, but it's their hook. So here's what they say. Let's look at the Midrash. It's a Talmudic teaching from Shimon ben Pazi, who lived in the 3rd century in Israel, in Tiberias, and is quoted in the Talmud, right, and codified much later on, 400 years later. Here's what he writes. Okay, so you can, I wish I would have put them next back to back, but Shimon ben Pazi raised a contradiction between two verses. It is written, and God made two great lights. And it's also written in the same verse, the greater light to rule in the day and the lesser light to rule at night, indicating that only one was great. Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi explains, when God first created the sun and the moon, they were created equally bright. But then the moon said, listen to this Midrash, the moon said before the Holy One of Blessing, blessed be He, Master of the universe, Ribono Shel Olam, v'chi efshar l'shnei melachim lishtamish b'keser echad. Is it possible for two kings to serve with one crown? One of us must be subservient to the other. And God therefore said to her, i.e. the moon, if so, go and diminish yourself. L'chi ham'iti et atzmech. Go make yourself smaller. She said before God, Master of the universe, since I said a correct observation before you, why should I go and diminish myself? God said to her, as compensation, go and rule both during the day, along with the sun, and during the night. But she said to him, what's the greatness of shining alongside the sun? What use is a candle in the middle of the day? And God said to her, go, let the Jewish people count the days and years with you, and this will be your greatness. She said to him, but the Jewish people will count with the sun as well, as it is impossible that they will not count seasons with it, as it's written, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. God said to her, go, let righteous men be named after you. Just as you are called the lesser light, there will be a Yaakov HaKatan, Jacob our forefather was called the small one. Shmuel, who was a Tannaitic 2nd century rabbi, was also called the small one. King David is also called in the book of Samuel, the small one. God saw that the moon was not comforted. So God said to her, bring atonement for me, since I diminished you. The Gemara notes, and this is what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish wrote, that what is different about the goat of offering on the new moon, that it is stated with regard to it, for the Lord, the Holy One, blessed be He, said, the goat shall be my atonement for having diminished the size of the moon. If you don't have a little, closet somewhere where you keep off for some of these texts, like you got to find the closet and make a little space for these remarkable texts. This is crazy. Listen to this. This is the Midrash. Now, like getting into the mind of Midrash. Did everybody follow Midrash? You want me to say it over? Okay. So this rabbi said, he begins with the problem between the great light and then immediately becomes a great light and a small light. So he creates an entire story, a myth, a legend. Here's the legend. There's a conversation that happens in the space of those 10 letters, whatever it is, between the beginning of the verse and the end of the verse. And the conversation is between God and the moon. The moon came to God in this midrash, in the legend. It said, God, you gave me and the sun, both of us are called great, but that doesn't really work. I'm not sure why. He says it's like a phrase. Can there be two kings with one crown? In other words, only one of us can be great. Like a strange, like, it's a weird claim, right? But it's a legend, so it doesn't have to comport to our logic. So says the moon says to God that complaint, and God says, fine. If you're already complaining, something about your complaint is already you've already been elected. You're the one that gets chosen to have us to be smaller. So go make yourself smaller. So you said they can't have two kings with one crown. Fine, you'll be the smaller one.
The danger of speaking up.
The danger of speaking up. But it doesn't stop her from speaking up in the legend, which is amazing. She doesn't stop, right? She refused to stop. She said, wait a second, but I'm right. And then God doesn't say, no, you aren't. God says, oh, whoops. Okay, fine. Let me comfort you. Even though you're small, it's not such a bad thing to be small. Look at all the ways that it's going to be. Like the Jewish people are going to count the days. But first God says, well, wait a second, you're going to serve in the day and the night. And then she says, what good does that do me? If I'm going to be in the middle of the day and the sun is also out in its fullness, it's like a candle what good is the candle in front of the sun? Like that's nothing special. He's barely able to see me. So God says, okay, fine. The Jewish people are going to count by you. She says, well, wait a second. She's obviously looking for something unique, right? Something that I have that the sun doesn't have. He says, she says, well, the sun is also going to be counted. The Jewish people don't just count by the moon. They have a solar and a lunar calendar. Otherwise, the season will be off. It would be like the Muslims having Pesach in the middle of the winter. Like, it doesn't make sense. We have both a lunar and a solar calendar. So God says, oh, you're right about that. Let me see, what else can I offer you here? Right? And it goes on. That's the way the Midrash keeps going. I can offer you this, I can offer you that. Finally, right, she was not comforted. And because she was not comforted, this radical Midrash says that every Rosh Chodesh, every new moon, in the temple, they used to offer a number of offerings for the new moon. And one of the offerings was a goat, was called a Seir Chatat, a goat that was a sin offering. Now, what sin is involved on the new moon? There's no sin. Why do you have an offering of a sin offering in the temple? So this Rabbi Shimon Pazi writes, it's God's own sin offering. God says that I'm offering a sin offering for my sin, as it were, of making the moon small.
It's so deep.
It's deep, right? Everybody's like, whoa, what's going on? I'm like, that's deep. All right.
Can I say?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's so, there's something very profound about it, and I'm not like it's making me cry. Like I just feel like tears are flowing down my face, and I'm not exactly sure why.
Yeah, well, we'll get to it. We'll get to this in a second. I really want to hold off before we go into the meaning of it for a minute. I just want to go back to the flow of the actual of why we do Kiddush Levana, what Pagam of Levana, like how it, and then we'll get into the Midrash itself, okay? I want to stay a little bit light until we go, I want to hold this as a marker. We'll come back in about 10 minutes to it. I want to come back in 10 minutes. If everybody can give me 10 minutes, I'm going to go further in and then we'll come back, I promise, okay? So in the Gemara, if you look at the source for Kiddush Levana, the earliest source is in Sanhedrin Mem Aleph Bet, source number 12 here, where a certain rabbi named Achra Bar Chanina, who quoted Rabbi Asi, who quoted Rabbi Yochanan, says that Ad Kama Mevarchin al HaChodesh Ad Shetitmalei Pegimata. So we already have in the Talmud the notion that the waning of the moon, right, the waxing of the moon is a filling of its pagam. There is an injury which is seen as the fact that the moon's light waxes and wanes, and when it's in its fullness, you can keep saying the blessing of the new moon until it's full. Pigima, it's full. Right? You see this in source 12. It's also even more powerful here. One second. So you see here, until the flaw of the moon is filled, when it no longer appears deficient. So there's already there's something about the moon's not being in its full light that is associated with the pigam, that it's like an injury, right? So here we have a kind of a source that is like in the Golden Bow, like the rabbinic legend is trying to explain why the moon has to wax and wane. The sun never waxes and wanes. The sun is always complete in its intensity. But there's something about the moon that, again, without access to, well, that's just like the universe works that way. They're trying to have rational or mythic explanation for a natural phenomenon. Why does the moon have to go through these cycles? And instead of seeing it as something that's a given or something that's powerful, it's initially framed as a deficiency. And so we add our prayers to the deficiency of the moon in the first 2 weeks until the moon is in its completeness. Okay? His, So there's this rabbinic moment, right? But then they begin to give it a much more powerful valence. Look at this. In the very next line in the Talmud, they say, Kol ha'mevarech al hachodesh bizmano, ki'ilu mekabel pnei hashchina. This is remarkable. That if you bless the moon in its time, meaning, right, even before it's full, it's as if you are greeting the face of the divine feminine, the Shekhinah. Right? And therefore, the Talmud says, if that's the case, then people are supposed to do it while they're standing. You can't sit and bless the moon, you have to stand and bless the moon. Because if you're greeting God, you have to stand up. So already now this prayer, which is kind of helping the injury of the moon, is also participating in meeting the divine feminine, or the divine Shekhinah, the divine presence. It's a holy moment. It's a big deal. It becomes, if you look here in the sources, if you look here in this source here, in the Aruch HaShulchan, a much later halachic source, 19th century, Baruch Epstein, this is what he writes. Therefore, the one who sees the moon in her renewal, blessed is the one with whose word they created Shchakim. And the firmament is here called Shchakim. There are 7 firmaments. We explain this, right? There are different types of heavens. And therefore, he says, this is not where I wanted it. 1 second. Go here. Here. It's not what I wanted. 1 second. This isn't a sad moment. I'm sorry, I was going to say something about it being a happy time. A law and a time they gave to them that they should not change their courses. The time is all the days, being glad and rejoicing to do the will of their Creator. As it is written, the sun rejoices like a hero. He's quoting all these sources, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is not the source I wanted. I'm sorry. Let's go here. Okay, I feel like there's a lot of energy in the room to talk about the midrash. That's why I'm like, there's almost nothing I could say here that would be even remotely as interesting as what we're talking about the midrash. But I wanted to say that there are. Okay, let's get to the midrash. Let's get to the midrash. I wanted to talk about the dancing because the dancing is really amazing. This dancing business is really out of control. And then I'm going to come back to the midrash, which was at the end. But before we go back to the midrash, let me just say two more interesting things about the actual ritual itself. And then I know our committee wants not just to know about the concrete, but about the metaphors and all the meanings behind it. We'll go to that. But there are some who are dancing, and it's a very strange thing to dance, like a really weird thing, this dancing business, to try to touch the moon. And there are some who wrote that when you dance, you have to make sure that you don't bow in front of the moon because it will seem as if you're worshiping the moon. Now, this is a 20th century writer, Rabbi Chaim Yehuda Ehrenreich, who wrote, Devar harikida hazot. This thing that we're dancing, im ein ze zarut, isn't this a weird thing to see Jews trying to dance and touch the moon? Halo rachok umuzar tnu'a kazot b'shar tfilot. says, would anybody ever see anybody, maybe if they came to Romemu, they would see it. But like, at this point in the 19th century, you're not going to see people jumping and trying to touch the ceiling, and you see this weird thing. You go out to the streets in the 19th century, in the 17th century, you see people trying to touch the moon. It's like, what's going on here? It says it's so weird that even if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, who brings this commentary, practice, he makes sure in the 17th, already in the 16th century, the Shulchan Aruch Yosef Karo wrote, "Yizaher shelo yichra." You make sure that you don't bow, right? Make sure that you're standing straight, because if you bow, the mechzik korel levana, it'll look as if you're bowing before the moon, right? It's a moon dance. We don't want it. It's a wonderful night for a moon dance, but you don't do that. In kin chashash avodah zarah nagabo. If you bow to the moon, there's a fear, a suspicion that you might be involved in idolatry, and that's anathema to Jewish people. But why then did they not remove this custom? He should have written down, don't do it. Right? He said, but you know what? This is very Mordechai Kaplan. Very Mordechai Kaplan. What does he write? He's living around, a little bit before. Right, anyway, he writes that lo ratzu v'gam efshar haya lahasiro michayei umah. It had become so entrenched amongst the Jewish people for centuries to try to touch the moon that even if some great halakhic commentator had said, don't do it because it looks as if you're bound to the moon, wouldn't have mattered. Because Catholic Israel, the people of Israel decided that we're going to dance and try to touch the moon, and nobody was going to stop them. Nobody was going to stop them. Even if it looked as if it was like, it was a minhag of Avodah Zarah, that there was a chance that you might, it would have been perceived as an idolatrous moment. Now, another element that I didn't discuss, I forgot to do it because I thought I'd have more time, is that in the actual rite itself, in the passage that we do, when you do Kiddush Levana, you say verses backwards and forwards sometimes, which is, I'm looking at Alan, like, it's weird. You take a verse, you say it forward, and then you chop it up and say it 3 different ways. Completely. So look at Joshua Trachtenberg, who's one of the most important works on Jewish magic and superstition. I thought you'd appreciate this too, and a lot of us who like magic and superstition, I don't know where Eden is, but the incantation was the most prominent element in Jewish magic. The incantation comprised several ingredients, all more or less constant, and appealed to ancient masters of magic, such as a statement that a certain chant, or a certain charm rather, for intelligence was performed by our teacher Moses on behalf of Joshua, citations from or allusions to biblical passages, the invocation of angels, the enunciation of holy names, and finally the specific request or command. A familiar characteristic of magic is the injunction to do things in reverse, to walk backward, to put one's clothing on backward, to throw things behind one's back. The same principle applies in incantations, and Talmudic and medieval Jewish charms amply illustrate its operation. Biblical quotations were often recited both forward and backward. Lishuatcha kiviti Adonai, Adonai lishuatcha kiviti. That's what you say. It's a verse from the end of the book of Genesis where Jacob says, in the middle of his blessings of his children, he cries out in the middle of it, God, I hope for your deliverance. So you take that verse and you say it forwards, and then you stop and you say it slightly differently. Lishuatcha kiviti Adonai is forward, to your salvation I am hoping, God. And you say, Adonai lishuatcha kiviti. And then you reverse it. And you put God's name first, and you do this 3 times, multiples of 3, right? So these are recited backwards and forwards. Mystical names were reversed. Sometimes words were equally written backward as they were to be uttered, so that it requires considerable mental agility not to be taken in by the unnatural rendering. Phrases that are capable of being read alike in either direction were especially highly prized. The purpose was to capitalize the mystery of the bizarre and the unfamiliar, and the power that it is associated with the ability to reverse the natural order of things. Right? We're trying to reverse it. Right? Okay, so I can go into, I'll send this out to people who can read other examples of this in the Encyclopedia of Jewish Myth, and so on. Fascinating connections to Greco-Roman periods with Jewish incantations. Now, this is one of the reasons that in the rite of the Kiddush Levana said right, on any Saturday night between the new moon and its being a full moon, that you are commanded at the end of it to finish with Aleinu. We're already finished with our prayers for the evening, and we come outside and we do this ritual. And then the rabbi said, you have to say the Aleinu. Now, why do you say the Aleinu? So apparently it's because after it appears as though you're worshiping stars and moons, you have to come back in and say, Aleinu l'shabeach. It is upon us to praise you, God, not the stars and the moon. It's kind of like a corrective against any appearance, right? There's a deeper meaning someone gives because Joshua was compared to the moon, and Joshua apparently wrote the Aleinu. Doesn't matter. But there's something about the magic of it that is dangerous. Okay, let's go back to I thought this was cute also to talk about how in the right as it appears here, can you see source 41? This is from Rav Yaakov Emden in the late 1700s, early 18th century. Yaakov Emden was one of the preeminent halachic precise source in that period. He has a strange custom here that you can't. It's written right here, where you can ask when you say, "Just as I danced to touch you, but I can't." Moon, may all of my enemies also not be able to touch me. And there you can put in a request for other things that you need from God. And one of the ones that was most prominent, which makes its way into the text, is that if you have any toothaches, that God should heal your toothaches.
Interesting.
How did toothaches make it in to this moon dance? It's really remarkable. And I love that in the sources, like it's actually found in a 20th century, those of us who grew up with a certain Rebbe called the Steipler Rav Chaim Kanievsky, who was one of the great and most ascetic and mystical of the 20th century, and scary. He was very scary rabbi. Stories about him abound. He also apparently this is a source which shows that he used to also teach that you should, if you had a toothache, you should pray for it during this particular ritual. Okay, let's go back to the women, the overlays of women and the meaning of the feminine and this whole geschäft with this moon business. Okay, so let's go back to the midrash. There's a moon. She comes to God and she says, "Not fair. It's not right. There should be two kings cannot serve with one crown." And then Shimon ben Pazi says, "There's this whole back and forth." Okay, so you were crying, and you don't know why you were crying. Okay, so do you want to explore that?
Sure, yeah.
Why don't we explore? We could also let's sit in this for the next 20 minutes. Let's sit inside of this midrash and its implications and how it's been understood by others and how it might land for us. There's this natural phenomena, which is the moon's waxing and waning. We have a midrashic hook that says that the moon and the sun were both great, but then one of them is called the smaller and one is called the bigger. What happened to the moon being big? And if the moon is analogized to the feminine, it hurts to imagine that the feminine is being punished for raising its voice or her voice in this midrashic. Again, trying to keep all the layers without assuming, again, as we saw, the moon is male in other cultures too, but in our culture it's feminine, and its implications for this conversation that happened in the 3rd century. Shimon Pazi is in Palestine in the 3rd century. What's he trying to say? And what are the implications about the various ways that God tries to comfort the moon and she's not comforted? And what does it mean that God brings an atonement for God's own? What does that mean? All those things. So there's a lot in the tradition about it, but first I want to see what's going on here. So Jesse, what's going
I
on?
have no idea. I'm like crying again. Does anybody else feel that way? You feel that way. But what is it?
And then I'll also, now is a good time for also, if there are people I can't see in the synagogue who have their hands up. Caroline,
Jay, yeah.
I can't see anything. So I just take a couple of voices inside and then we'll go to the synagogue, okay?
My tears are wildly associative and not analytic, so maybe it's more magic. But the first time and now every time I see the Torah walked around the congregation in the arms of someone with the scroll handles lifted, I always see like a 2 or 3-year-old child in someone's arms with their hands raised, like reaching for the sky.
Yeah.
Like I've always seen the Torah as that little child. And the reason is I have this rare sense memory of myself being 2 or 3 years old, running out into the night to try to grab the moon, reaching up like that with my arms as far as they would go.
Like Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah,
Last of the moon.
just so, like a full moon, a night of the full moon when I was about 3. And my dad like ran out after me because I was not supposed to be out there.
Okay.
And he lifted me and he was like, "What are you trying to do?" "I'll get to the moon."
Trying to catch the moon.
And he lifted me up, like, like this,
Right.
like holding the toy. He lifted me up as far as I could, and he's like, "That's as far as I can lift you,
Oh.
as close as I can get."
Uh,
And in thinking about big and little, like, that doesn't get you to the moon, but it does get you a little bit closer. Like,
yeah.
the moon is millions of miles away, but being raised is still being raised. So there's bigness in the littleness. There's aggrandizement even in the smallest gesture. There's something.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot. Keep going. I mean, I'll share some of the more traditional in a moment, but I'd like to. This is beautiful, Torah. So, Jess, do you want to speak to this, or
I
and then we'll move
so.
around, and then we have a couple people online, I'm sure.
There's something, I mean, there's something almost like, I don't know, it's so deep for me. Like, I just feel like sobbing. It's so weird. But I think there's something like, something about like being visible and feeling hurt and having like divine presence be like, I'm here for you and I love you and let me figure out some way to lift you, and it's incumbent upon all of us to lift one another. Like that's something that is, so inherent to Judaism. And here God is saying to us, even I'm hurting because I hurt you and let me lift you. It's almost like reparenting, like the hurt that we might feel for sort of for speaking up and being visible, and you risk something by being visible and saying what you think, and you could get hurt, and God is just there for us.
So you love God in the Midrash is like the parent who initially maybe reacts in a way that is not ideal, but then God stays in a relationship with the moon as the moon continues to show in this conversation, mythic conversation. The moon is a very heroic figure because it stands up to God, and God doesn't punish her, as it were. It's her for her voice. Initially, God does, but then God realizes that was a mistake. So it's a very Midrash is very evocative in that way. God is not seen as this unmoved mover. God is moved, right, in the Midrash, by the response of the moon, and then tries to make amends, and then ultimately says, "Forever, I will forever be." Until everything is made right, I'm okay with a monthly reminder of my mistake, as it were, which is pretty amazing.
And maybe just like parents don't do that sometimes. Like a parent could hurt and then just be like, leave you there. And there's some way in which like
becomes very psychologically.
That's our wish, right? That the parent would come back and say, "Oh, I hurt, and let me lift you. I'm here for you." That often doesn't happen.
It's a pretty amazing theological moment in the 3rd century.
Healing.
Okay, so we're going to move around because that was. I want to make sure that and then we have to use people online. I promise to come back. I just want to go back and forth. Yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
To that point,
Wow.
is there another Talmudic explanation for why a sin offering is given on the new moon other than this midrash?
It's a good question. I always just looked at it this way. I think it might have been just part of is a sin offering offered in other contexts is it only Rosh Chodesh and not only the Chagin? Good question. I think it's only on Rosh Chodesh. That's what makes it so unique. And
Just as like a renewal to
yeah, it's a good
like
question.
this
It's a really good question. I'm not sure. I mean, there are certainly more elegant explanations than that God's sin. It's God's sin. It could be for the sin of the Jewish people, right?
It usually is.
Every month, you make sure that you start off the month with some form of atonement for a general atonement for whatever it is that what's coming. Doesn't that, I mean, it's pretty wild to go from there to God's own sin offering.
It's starting over, right?
Yeah, it's starting over, starting anew, that kind of thing. Let's go to some people online and I promise to come back to the room because I can't see anybody online, but go ahead, Caroline.
Yes, Jay.
No
Shabbat
problem.
Shalom. This may be simple-minded and may be unpopular, but it never stopped me before. In terms of the fundamental problematic, we have the two great lights and the moon is diminished, or Hakatan, and that wonderful midrash, the moon steps forward. The moon is the Gaon. She is the wise one here who points out the problem, and she, in a way, gets knocked down for it. My question or my thought is this really about the fundamental insecurity about the power of women, about the power of the feminine, and that the sin offering is, in essence, an attempt to recognize and mollify that power? That do not touch the moon, do not worship the moon. All that is sort of this fundamental ambivalence about recognizing that power and the diminishment of that power.
So you went you went into an early place. Well, first of all, the moon asks a question that, of course, is that there's a much more problematic question, which is what purpose would there be if both of them are great? Then why do we need both of them? Like, why do we need two great lights? If they're both great, what differentiates night from day? I mean, there are a number of fundamental questions in the Midrash that are deeply problematic in terms of, like, none of it really, when you begin to look at it, it begins to make no sense. Like, you needed to have, if the moon's light was equal to the light of the sun, then what would night look like? And why have two instead of one? If they were both of equal greatness and equal capacity, there are a lot of questions here. But certainly, once the moon is analogized to the feminine, and has a persona, is personified as the feminine, which is, again, it's not a given, but it does emerge in rabbinic sources. Then in Kabbalah, certainly in early stages of Kabbalah, as you'll see also, is not only is the moon analogized to the feminine, but so is the entire Ecclesia Israel. It's not just feminine as women, i.e. women, but all of the children of Israel. The reason why the Midrash says you are going to be analogized to King David. King David in Kabbalah will represent all of the children of Israel, will be compared to the moon. And just as the children of Israel wax and wane, sometimes we are in our fullness and sometimes we are less than in our fullness. The moon becomes analogized to feminine. The entire Jewish people become analogized to the feminine, to Malchut. And the fact that the Jewish people were without political sovereignty and power was analogized to our pagam, our own lack of strength, our own light, and that we needed light from the other nations of the world and so on. So there's a long history of the feminine being both diminished and, as you say, a wariness of the feminine, perhaps, and also a descriptive reality of the feminine's non-emergence in a patriarchal culture. And in Kabbalah, to its credit, the future Messianic era is a time when the feminine will reemerge. And just as the Jewish people will reemerge, so will the feminine be reemerged. And when the prophet Isaiah said, the light of the feminine or the moon will be as great as the light of the sun, they were unabashedly claiming that at one point in time, there would be a full egalitarianism in the world and within Judaism. Of course, we're a far cry from that in the last 2,000 years, and certainly I'm not only going to show that the rabbinic culture did a lot to help to bring that forward all the time. I'd say that they didn't. Not ashamed of that. It's just they weren't forward thinking in that way. Thank God we're in a different era. And I don't know about the fear of the moon, worshiping the moon as a fear of the feminine, though. I would say that in general, the biblical authors were in a polemic against worshiping anything other than God, period. Period. Like, not moon, not sun, It wasn't like, oh, the feminine is the moon, so we're not going to worship the moon. But since the sun is the masculine, we'll worship the sun. That was also anathema to them. So, but I'd say that you're spot on with the general thrust of Jewish intellectual history is that this is a midrash that is descriptive of a reality where the feminine is subservient to the masculine, and that at some point they imagined that there would be a tikkun that way.
But with
Which is-
respect, we're dealing with in Genesis with one of the first phrases in our Torah, and I would think that this issue of the agricultural versus the hunting goes much deeper and much earlier than the rabbinic commentaries. And it's interesting that in that midrash, in fact, the feminine is the superior. It's the gaon. I mean, that word is used, and the reaction to the feminine being superior is diminishing. So that's the problematic I'm dealing with.
I'm not sure. I didn't understand the Bible itself is not saying that worshiping the moon is
No, that midrash, the first midrash of that first phrase that we read. It is the
right.
moon that comes forth as a feminine who points out the problematic and
Right.
is acknowledged as being smart and wise for doing that and is diminished.
Right.
That to me is the interesting dynamic here. That's still
Yeah,
not explained.
Yeah, again, so the rabbis are descriptively are trying to describe the reality on the ground. The rabbis are fully aware of the feminine, quote unquote, being diminished in this world and naming it as a potential redemptive in the future, right? And so it's not their own fear, it's they're describing the reality where the feminine in their culture is diminished and imagining in a problematic way that in the future days it will be redeemed, but not in their own culture. So Rav Shimon ben Pazzi doesn't say overtly, and this means that we should honor the feminine, right? There is either a fear, as you would say, or a description of already a diminished feminine in the world that they are living in for all kinds of other very complicated and diverse reasons. Okay, yeah.
My comment is nearly as erudite, but my observation in all of this is that it's important to acknowledge that we can stare at the moon. We can examine its qualities
Sure.
in a way we cannot with the sun. And I think underneath it all, in New York, we can't feel it as much, but if you spend any time out of the city in the dark, you notice the moon, whether it's
Sure.
full or not. And you notice the changing qualities of that light over and I think that somehow I feel that in all of these texts, somehow that it's that we have this connection to the moon that I don't think we have with the sun. We can feel it has an animated quality because we can look at it and feel our connection to it in a certain way. And I don't know if Eric Bach, the academic and musician, was reading these texts when he wrote this, but I have to say, I just have to recite these. It's about 5 seconds of lyrics to this. It's really a little pub song he wrote, so think of it kind of swaying in big harmonies. It's long life to the moon for a fine noble creature that serves us as lamplight each night in the dark, while the sun only shines in the day, which by nature needs no light at all, as these all may remark. Just to add a little
Nice.
touch, but I think that
Very, very Jungian. I mean, where Carl Jung starts to talk about the moon, he talks about her blue gentle light.
Yes.
It allows sufficient illumination to keep knocking into things, but also to allow it to see things.
But it's
in
not
the
always
halo.
there, so
Right.
we realize its importance when
Right.
it is.
Right. So the waxing and the waning of the moon, again, it would be interesting just to describe, like, to do a deep dive on why we humans need to personify nature itself. Like, what is that movement from, right, the prophetic comparing of the moon to the sun? Already, were those not our traditions, that we could be having a much different conversation, and we wouldn't be reading our mythic text this morning in quite the same way. We're given, right, a text about creation, about cosmology. The story of cosmology, the story of the creation of the world is clearly intended as a mythic explanation for what we have already discovered. But then the rabbis read into it something, again, they overlay a mythic structure. The human mind is set with patterns and a yearning for meaning. And so they project onto this, onto the physical world, some story. And the story here tells us more about the rabbis and about their view of the world than it does about why there's a moon, why it waxes and wanes and so on, how it's set, One of the rabbis who, looking at this, the Aruch HaShulchan writes that the reason why the moon, of all the planets, which is of course not a planet, but of all the planets, is analogized and personified is because it's the one that's closest to us, next to Mercury, he says. Which of course, he knew astronomy at that point. The moon, it's our moon, like it's our moon. And the moon goes in and out of and it's clearly in a relationship with the sun, right? With this great galactic source of light and heat, and our world would not be what it is without the sun. So clearly the sun plays a central role in life itself. Organic life would not be what it is without the sun. And the moon seems to have a diminished role, but whatever that is, or doesn't have a role at all. It just is what it is, right? But for the rabbis, they're fascinated by the fact that the light of the moon is not its own light. What does it mean that the moon does not have a light of its own, but reflects the light of something greater? So it depends on where you're standing. Do you see that as a good quality? Is that a valence that is valorized? Or is it a weakness of the moon? So there are two schools of thought. One school of thought says that it's a weakness, that the very thing that the moon complained about was that she wanted her own light, not light reflected and refracted by the sun. And God realized that that was a complaint that was worth in the personification here in the Midrash. Of course she should have her own light. Why should she have to light someone else's light? Right? So in that school of thought, right, the moon was not diminished, but the moon complained that its role was diminished because she herself valorized having her own light. Right? She herself said that's the greatest value. And God initially thought, what do you mean? You don't have to produce anything on your own. All you're going to do is receive the light from the sun and then give it to people in the nighttime when they need it, right? And you'll also have enough light, not too strong, so that by the day it'll be also there. So there's that school of thought that saw her complaint as a complaint not about size, but about ownership. And that in that school of thought, the future will be not that she'll be as great as the sun's light, but that she'll have a light of her own. It won't be as great as the sun's light, but it won't be refracted from the sun's light. But then there's a whole other school of thought that says no, that just as Israel waxes and wanes, and sometimes it doesn't receive light from below, but receives it only from above, it's a good thing to be empty and to receive light from the sun. And then in that school of thought, the complaint is not, the complaint will be healed when we realize that it's great to receive light from, like it's okay, that we don't have to be as big as the nations of the world. We don't have to be as strong as everybody else, but we'll have a different source of light. And that source of light will be, a moonlight. So I just wanted to also read to you from Rav Soloveitchik, who was a great 20th century Orthodox thinker, who said this. He said this entire metaphor is about the Odyssey, about the problem of good things happening to bad people and bad things happening to good people. And he writes, this is one of his great students, Herschel Schachter, whom I studied with at YU. I heard from my great teacher that the reason why we pray that the moon's light will be filled is, he said, why should it matter to us if the moon has less light? Why are we praying for the moon's light to be filled? Is that the greatest pain that bothers the Jewish people, that the moon's light, that it gets a special prayer on a Saturday night, make sure that the moon's light is bigger, or that we fulfill its pagam, its injury, or its deficiency? I'll do this later, thank you. Is Morel Inyan Zed Ba'ayat Harash Ba'lam. He says the moon's deficiency is an analogy to the problem of evil in the world. We know that the Talmud says that Moses himself, when he was on Mount Sinai in the Bible, he was up there for 40 days and 40 nights. One of his questions to God was, explain to me how you run the world, where good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. It seems as if, the world doesn't have any order, it seems as though there's no moral inventory in this world. שמי שמנהיג את העולם הטבעי לא זוהי מי שנתן את חוקי התורה. That you can imagine that there's like a clockwork, the natural world works by itself, but that the moral world is without any moral valence. Mahmat chesronot shebein haragat olam. He says, like, it's really a problem that we live in a world where we feel as though sometimes the natural order of things, right, and the moral order of things are out of alignment, right? That's what he says is really going on. Sometimes the righteous ones receive reward, don't receive reward, and those who are evil receive reward. People who are completely immoral, completely evil, who act in a way that's completely unskillful and make a horrible world to others, somehow, they flourish. He said, that's the greatest problem that all of us live with in the world. Right? How do we make sense and meaning in a world that seems to be meaningless and chaotic and random? He says that most people in the world don't believe when they look on the world that there could be possibly any larger narrative that explains how this world